From advertising to software as a service to data.
Across all of our programs and clients, we've seen a 55 to 65% open rate.
Getting brands authentically integrated into content performs better than TV advertising.
Typical lifespan of an article is about 24 to 36 hours.
If we're reaching out to the right person with the right message and a clear call to action, then it's just a matter of timing.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast, a Ben J. Schaap LLC production. In this podcast, you'll hear the stories of world-class marketers that use technology to drive business results and achieve career success. We'll unearth the real-world experiences of some of the brightest minds in the marketing and technology space so you can learn the tools, tips, and tricks they've learned along the way. Now here's the host of the MarTech Podcast, Benjamin Shapiro.
Welcome back to the MarTech Podcast. It's just you and me today, marketers. And in today's episode, I want to give you an update on how this show is growing and how we're putting some of the learnings that we've gathered from our first few episodes into practice. We're now 1 month into the production of this podcast, and I want to let you, our listeners, behind the curtain so you can see how we practice what we preach in the promotion of this show. In the first episode of the MarTech Podcast, I outlined the foundation of this show's marketing philosophy by walking you through how I think of our customer segmentation. For those of you who are new to marketing, or if you didn't listen to that episode, customer segmentation is the process of breaking your customer base into groups with specific problems that you can target and solve with your product. When planning for this show's launch, we were targeting two primary segments. The first is our marketing professionals who already have careers in marketing and are looking for ways to stay educated and aware of trends in our industry. And the second is our marketing novices who want to learn the foundation of marketing. That said, now that we're a month into the life of the MarTech Podcast, I want to share with you some of the tools we've used to promote the show, what data we've collected, and how that impacts our plans moving forward. For context, my goal is to generate 10,000 downloads per month for this podcast. If you listen to our episode about podcast advertising with Chris Smith from Knit Audio, you know that the 10,000 download per month milestone is when you can start to monetize a podcast and make more than beer money. So where are we today? Well, we're not quite there yet. In our first month, this podcast has been downloaded roughly 250 times. And while that might not seem like a big number, what really matters at this early stage is the growth rate. So far in the first week of our second month, the podcast has been downloaded 100 times, which means if our growth rate stays flat for the rest of the month, we're on pace to reach 400 downloads this month. Now, in reality, I think our growth rate will continue to accelerate, so I'm hoping that we're going to reach 1,000 downloads by the end of month 2, which isn't bad considering our goal is to get to 10,000. The moral of the story is that every business starts at zero, and when you're in the early stages of development, what matters most is learning about what your initial users want and validate what marketing channels create the best bang for your buck. That said, let's start off by talking about what we've done to promote the show so far. For starters, when I first launched the show, I leveraged my personal network to reach our first few listeners. As I mentioned on our episode about email outreach with Kevin Warner from Leadium, I've emailed about 185 marketers from my personal network, which generated roughly 100 downloads. Now let's think about that. Every email I sent generated a half a download. That's not bad. Outside of the email campaign that I launched, I posted each one of my episodes to LinkedIn, Twitter, sometimes on Facebook to keep the impression level of my show high with my professional network. More importantly, I've also asked the guests on my show to share their interviews with their networks with the hope of expanding my reach to a new highly qualified audience. Lastly, I've spent about $50 targeting CNN podcasts that talk about marketing using the keyword targeting feature with our friends at AdNet. Okay, so we spent about $50 on ads, we've done some networking, and a fair amount of hustle to get the podcast produced and launched this month. What have we learned? For starters, according to Apple's podcast analytics, 92% of the listeners in this show are subscribers. So the audience that we've reached is sticking around. That's a great thing. That said, on average, you, our listeners, are only listening to about 50 to 60% of each episode. So what that tells me is we need to provide you with shorter pieces of content. So moving forward, we'll be breaking our interviews into 2 episodes per week. And that does 2 things. First, it allows us to give you shorter pieces of content so you get the information you want in a more digestible format. And two, it allows us to publish more episodes, which will help us increase our download count. Okay, great. We have an awesome audience that wants shorter pieces of content. Check. But how are you finding out about this show? According to Google Analytics, 50% of our users that go to the MarTech Podcast website arrive via social network referrals. 30% of you come directly by typing in martechpod.com into your browser, and 20% of you are coming from organic search or some other form of referral. What that tells me is social networks are our biggest drivers of content consumers, so we need to think about how to pour more gas onto that fire. The good news is I've already recorded an episode with a great paid social marketer, which you'll hear in a few weeks, so I have a couple tricks up my sleeve. I'll let you in on the secret. The plan is to do two things. First, create lookalike audiences, which means that we're going to target people who have similar profiles to those who have already visited our site and are consuming our content. And two, launch a retargeting campaign, which means that we're going to advertise to people who have already visited our content pages but haven't clicked a subscribe button. Our hope for those two strategies is we're going to reach a highly targeted new audience with our lookalike advertising, and we're also going to continually engage with people that are interested in our content with our retargeting. In terms of driving direct traffic, since this podcast has only been around for a month and doesn't have great brand recognition yet, I can only assume that the direct traffic that's coming to us is being driven from our podcast advertising on AdNet. As it turns out, people who listen to podcasts are likely to be in search of other great podcasts. So I'm also looking for ways to expand our podcast advertising reach. That seems like an awful lot to cover for our next month. So let's just stop there. All right, let's recap. We're 1 month into working on the MarTech podcast. We're trying to reach 10,000 downloads per month, and we've gone from 0 to a few hundred listeners in 1 month. People are finding out about our show through social networks and podcast advertising. You, our listeners, are sticking around with the show, but you're not listening to the entire episodes. So in this next month, we're going to test breaking our interviews into 2 shorter episodes. We're going to expand our reach by continuing to advertise on podcasts, and we're also going to be testing some social networking advertising. When I take a step back and think about the first month of the MarTech podcast, our focus has been on building a great show for you, our listeners, and I feel like we're off to a good start. I want to thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button in your podcast feed for a regular feed of marketing knowledge. We'd also love for you to share this podcast with your friends, and if you're feeling super generous, give us a rating in the iTunes store. We also want you, our listeners, to feel like you're part of a community. So if you have any questions, you can email me directly at podcast@benjshap. You can reach us on Twitter. My new business handle is @BenJShapLLC, BenJShapLLC. Or you can reach us on our Facebook page, which is also Ben J. Shap LLC. Coming up in the next few weeks, you're going to hear us interview experts in the paid social, influencer marketing, and growth hacking fields. We really hope you stick with this show. Thank you for being our listeners. And until the next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.